On this Tuesday night, the toll of Russia's war in Ukraine. Why the UN believes more civilians have died than what's been officially reported.
We are working to corroborate every single incident.
And a warm welcome for Ukrainians in Newfoundland and Labrador.
I'll take the bag for you.
Oil companies making record profits, the pressure to invest it in clean energy. Critics call the federal environmental impact law a pipeline killer. Now Alberta's top court says it's unconstitutional. And the art of smashing records.
It's the highest price ever paid.
The staggering sale of this work by Andy Warhol.
Global National with Donna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. There is a warning tonight. The extent of the death toll in Ukraine is likely to be far higher than what's been reported. The head of the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission says thousands more civilians have died than are accounted for in the official figure of 3,400. Exact numbers are impossible to gather right now because some areas, such as the bombarded city of Mariupol, can't be accessed. As well, the World Health Organization says the conflict's impact on Ukraine's healthcare system has led to 3,000 preventable deaths. Russian troops have suffered big setbacks too, but the American Director of National Intelligence said today the U.S. believes Russia's president is in this for the long haul.
But Putin most likely also judges that Russia has a greater ability and willingness to endure challenges than his adversaries, and he is probably counting on U.S. and EU resolve to weaken as food shortages, inflation, energy prices get worse.
After more than 10 weeks, it's becoming a terrible endurance test for the Ukrainian people. Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight.
Germany's foreign minister reopens the country's embassy in Kyiv, the latest nation to do so, returning some sense of normalcy to Ukraine's capital. But elsewhere in the country, the war rages. More airstrikes in the port city of Odessa, killing one person. And as Ukraine claims to have retaken some villages in Kharkiv region, officials there say 44 bodies have been found in the ruins of a building destroyed back in March. The United Nations official number for civilian deaths is almost 3,400, but they added a troubling caveat Tuesday.
All I can say for now is that it is thousands higher than the numbers that we have currently given to you. The big black hole is really Mariupol, where it's been difficult for us to fully access and to get fully corroborated information.
The mayor of Mariupol has said as many as 20,000 civilians may have died there after Russian attacks obliterated much of the city. Ukrainian troops still inside the besieged Azovstal steelworks claim 100 civilians remain with them. That after it was thought the last of the civilians were evacuated over the weekend. Any who are ill may face further struggles, with a warning Tuesday about the war's impact on healthcare.
40% of households have at least one member in need of chronic treatment that they can no longer find, resulting in an estimated at least 3,000 premature avoidable deaths.
From health to food, another call from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky for the world to help with its grain exports.
It's sitting on 8 billion euros worth of wheat right now from last year's harvest. They cannot export it. They have no access to the sea.
During his visit to Ukraine Sunday, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada would help find solutions.
It doesn't serve anyone if Vladimir Putin's war is not just killing Ukrainians, but is starving people around the world.
With ports out of action and train lines a frequent target, it will be far from easy. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Ukraine's population is 44 million people. Almost 6 million of those people have now fled the country. It is, according to the UN, the fastest growing refugee crisis since the Second World War. Most people are staying in nearby countries: Romania, Poland, Moldova, Hungary, and Slovakia. Poland, which has taken in more than 3 million Ukrainians. Most of those who have left are elders, women, and children. Most men under the age of 60 have been prohibited from leaving so they can join the fight. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians have also applied to come to Canada. Newfoundland and Labrador vowed back in March to offer safe haven to some of them, and the first government-sponsored plane load of displaced Ukrainians arrived last night. As Ross Lord reports, the Premier says hosting them is an honour.
In a province that takes pride in putting strangers at ease, this plane load of new arrivals lands right in Newfoundland and Labrador's comfort zone. Premier Andrew Furey greeting the first of 166 passengers, Angelica, as onlookers send their own messages of support. After fleeing the devastating Russian invasion, coming to a Canadian province whose rugged beauty helps offset its tenuous finances is a huge relief.
Stan has a job in Baver.
Welcome, Stan. Who's headed to Baver?
Baver to Wrangler Line.
Stan is a mining engineer. He says his father is still in central Ukraine, but urged him to leave.
But I very worry about my father. He's nominal, and he just told me that as I'm in this war, you have the chance for your future.
This first of its kind airlift cost an estimated $350,000, including on-the-ground logistics. It's a reward on another investment almost 2 months ago, when the province opened an office in Poland to help Ukrainians relocate, sorting out things like travel documents and transportation plans. As other provinces ramp up their support, the federal government is promising to move ahead with its own plans for targeted charter flights. The feds say they've received more than 204,000 applications from Ukrainians, approving more than 91,000, and that more than 24,000 have arrived in Canada since January 1st. Arriving Ukrainians have been granted an emergency travel visa that allows them to live and work in Canada for 3 years. And the Newfoundland and Labrador government says they'll get provincial Medicare and prescription drug coverage. Other challenges could take time, like nurturing this 7-year-old girl who doesn't speak English. With hundreds of other Ukrainians applying to fly here, these arrivals might be only the beginning of this small province's big relief effort. Ross Lord, Global News.
As fighting rages in Ukraine, oil and gas prices have been shooting up, in part because of the uncertainty about supplies from Russia. Anyone filling up their tank knows this. Canadian gas prices have hit record highs. The average price of a litre is $1.92 now. It's well over $2 in some places. And who is making record profits from it? Oil companies. Shell made $9.1 billion in the last quarter, nearly triple the amount from the same period last year. Chevron, $6.3 billion, quadruple last year's profits. Exxon, $5.5 billion. Canadian companies are swimming in profit too. Suncor made $2.95 billion in the first quarter, more than triple the amount from the same time last year. And Enbridge, Imperial Oil, Cenovus, and Canadian Natural Resources all made big profits in early 2022. Oil companies are now facing pressure over what to do with the windfall. Heather Urix-West looks at Canada's push to put that money to good use.
In a province known for beef and oil, surging energy prices are a provincial coffer cash cow. But Alberta's premier is frustrated.
We're concerned that these very strong commodity prices and big profits are not turning into jobs. Albertans rightly expect to see real economic benefit, particularly when prices and profits are this high.
After several difficult years for the industry, oil companies are reluctant to invest.
They're going back to shareholders and they're going to buybacks, and that's what a company does, is it makes money and then it sends it back to the shareholders.
What we have seen and heard so far from many of those same energy companies is that the investor community is saying, don't increase your production here.
And that's an issue as the world faces two big problems when it comes to fossil fuels. On one hand, there is a global oil shortage, and prices will only rise until there is more supply. But the climate crisis looms heavily as well, and the federal environment minister says oil companies need to pull their weight.
We think that these companies, with making record level profit, should invest as well in this decarbonization.
The oil and gas sector is Canada's biggest polluter, and if its largest producers are to reach their net zero by 2050 commitments, huge investments in carbon capture and other technologies will have to be made. But even with a federal tax incentive, oil companies are making no commitments yet.
What we're seeing is that there's no actual requirement for companies to actually make good on their net zero pledges. And so we will need to do something else to encourage companies to do that.
The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers says energy prices are volatile and can't be counted on for projects that will take decades of investment or more. For that, the industry says it will need more government help. Heather Urix-West, Global News, Calgary.
A significant court ruling in Alberta today. Alberta's Court of Appeal ruled the federal government's environmental assessment law is unconstitutional, finding it undermines Canada's division of powers and could effectively place provinces in an economic chokehold by regulating their natural resources. The Impact Assessment Act, formerly known as Bill C-69, allows Ottawa to assess how projects like pipelines will affect the environment and social issues. Alberta Premier Jason Kenney, who has dubbed it the No More Pipelines Law, launched a legal challenge. A majority of 5 justices sided with Alberta today, calling the act a breathtaking preemption of provincial authority. Kenney is happy, though the federal government said immediately the ruling will be appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada.
This is a huge win for the people of Alberta, for their right responsibly to develop their resources, the resources that belong to the people of this province.
The Alberta court has made a ruling today in a 4-to-1 split. Our view is the legislation remains constitutional and we will be appealing.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the law delivered on a promise to reform what he calls a broken system and restores public trust in how decisions on major projects are made. The case now goes to the Supreme Court, but the act remains in effect in the meantime. As COVID-19 drags into its 3rd year, the massive backlog of surgeries that has been piling up is beginning to decline. That's according to new data. Hospitals are working hard to help patients get the procedures they've been waiting for months or even years. Though, as Jamie Maracher reports, long wait times persist across the country, and healthcare workers fear not enough is being done to get things back to pre-pandemic levels.
Toronto surgeon Dr. Shafkachevji was finally starting to feel confident his team was catching up on delayed and cancelled surgeries. Then came Omicron.
Our backlog got a lot worse again because we had to slow down.
The constant stopping and starting of procedures as COVID-19 caseloads rise and fall, coupled with burnout of healthcare staff and limited OR space, forced long delays for elective surgeries such as cataracts and joint operations. Even transplants and cancer care were set back. Close to 600,000 fewer operations were performed across the country during the first 22 months of the pandemic compared to 2019. But the latest data from the Canadian Institute for Health Information reveals wait times are starting to improve.
The challenge going forward, though, is hospitals are still being hammered by COVID waves. Our numbers are changing.
Behind those numbers are real people suffering. Marla Marshall received her liver transplant in December after waiting 11 months.
You're essentially just getting sicker and sicker and waiting on an organ so that you can live.
Jessica Bailey first spoke to Global last September and is still waiting on her kidney transplant.
The longer I wait, the worse my health gets.
Bailey's sister says her condition has deteriorated after testing positive for COVID on Sunday.
We are trying to preserve the status quo. We are trying to do what we used to do and think that we can solve the problem just throwing money at this issue.
Ottawa promised $2 billion to help with the backlogs, but many provinces say it's not enough. Public health experts say the solution has to come at a hospital level, designating some operating rooms for emergency use and others for elective only, adding more operating hours, and even distributing surgeries appropriately between doctors. Kashevji says no matter the plan, time is not on our side.
Even if we're doing 110 or 115% of the usual run rate, you can see it's going to take us 10 to 20 months to catch up on the backlog.
Jamie Maracher, Global News, Toronto.
An unprecedented move for Prince Charles. Coming up, the ceremony the heir to the throne just performed for the first time. In London, Queen Elizabeth was not able to attend the state opening of Parliament today because of what Buckingham Palace calls mobility issues. Her son, Prince Charles, read the Queen's speech on her behalf.
My lords and members of the House of Commons.
The heir to the throne formally opened a new session of Parliament and read out the government's legislative agenda. His son, Prince William, and the imperial state crown were at his side. The Queen has missed the event just twice before, when she was pregnant with sons Andrew and Edward in 1959 and 1963. Sri Lanka's military has been granted emergency powers as that country works to quell deadly anti-government protests over the island's worst economic crisis in its history. Fighting on the streets has killed at least 7 people this week, injured hundreds of others, and a number of homes and vehicles were torched. Authorities can now detain people without warrants and also search property by force and shoot looters on sight. Protesters are calling for the president to resign. Misinformation station ahead, how Moscow's propaganda has survived on American airwaves. There's a global effort to crack down on Russian state propaganda, along with misinformation and disinformation, because of the invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin continues to make false claims, calling Ukrainians Nazis and saying Russia is protecting its own national security. And while Russia's state-owned media outlets have largely been taken off the air in the West, one Russian government broadcaster is still buying its way onto the airwaves in the U.S. Jackson Prosco explains.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Driving through Washington, you'll find the Kremlin's message on the dial at 105.5 FM.
And we are live from the Empire of Lies. And we're stacking up the lies in the empire.
That's Radio Sputnik, produced by Russia's state media company from studios just blocks from the White House.
But it's wielding this power, but the power seems to be backfiring on the United States.
The Russians are not only winning this thing, they're winning it decisively.
As Russia's war rages in Ukraine, Sputnik is selling a very different version of events, one where Russia is the victim.
This is the first time that it appears likely that it was the regime in Kiev killing its own citizens who it views as traitors.
Welcome back to Phone Lines. Critics and the U.S. government consider it pure propaganda. Sputnik's hosts claim they're just questioning the narrative, though some are unapologetically pro-Russia.
Part of what makes Sputnik so unusual is that it has managed to stay on the air, as other Russian state broadcasters have either been banned or ceased broadcasting in the West.
That's because Sputnik buys its way onto the airwaves. Filings with the U.S. Justice Department show Russia's state media company spent over $500,000 purchasing airtime in just the last 6 months of 2021.
If I felt that it was all misinformation, we wouldn't be airing it.
Peter Chartel owns KCXL Radio near Kansas City, Missouri. He's paid $5,000 per month to air 6 hours of Russian state programming every day.
And to say, well, you should shut down that programming because we don't agree with it, just is directly opposite of what free speech is all about.
The U.S. government feels differently. In 2018, it forced Sputnik and the American companies that air it to register as agents of a foreign government. They must air this disclaimer.
On behalf of the Federal State Unitary Enterprise Rossiya Sevodnya International Information Agency, Moscow, Russia.
Russia's war in Ukraine prompted the National Association of Broadcasters to go further. They've called on stations to drop all Russian programming. Stations have so far refused.
Viewers and listeners who know what they're watching and know that what they're watching is paid for can view that content with a certain degree of skepticism.
As the war soldiers on, so does Sputnik, escaping U.S. sanctions and reaching Americans directly. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
Worth way beyond 1,000 words. Next, the record-shattering price paid for this artwork. It's hard to believe there are people out there with $195 million US to spend on one piece of artwork, but an auction last night in New York City proves there is. Andy Warhol's silk screen of Marilyn Monroe sold for a record price to an unknown buyer. It has been copied, parodied, put on T-shirts and more, so just what makes it worth the record-breaking price? Eric Sorensen explains.
We come to the American dream, Warhol's sublime depiction of Marilyn Monroe.
Certainly an auctioneer's dream, America's most famous pop artist and Hollywood's most famous sex symbol.
100 million, at 110 million.
The bidding lasted all of 4 minutes.
To you, sir, at $170 million.
That, plus fees, and the unknown bidder will pay $195 million US, the highest ever at auction for a 20th century artwork, surpassing Picasso's Women of Algiers.
This particular Marilyn work by Warhol is one of the most recognizable images on the planet. It's a contemporary Mona Lisa.
Warhol was a gadabout on the New York art scene, but he was a mystery to most people.
Andy Warhol's reticence about himself.
He popularized the silk screen technique, creating a distance between the hand of the artist and the art.
Yes, I don't want to get too close to it.
His public persona seemed just as detached. His art a commentary on consumerism and overexposed celebrity, which his silkscreens could mass produce.
There's a certain brilliance in his mobilization of the technology to comment on his age. But you also think of Warhol as the critic and analyst of the late 20th century. He is the artist who really dissected fame, the image of fame, celebrity culture.
Kiss me, hold me tight.
Marilyn Monroe was the perfect symbol of celebrity culture. From this film, Warhol used just another publicity photo to create his most famous artwork. And famous art still seems immune to economic recession.
Over the last 2 years, with very unpredictable global times, people have gravitated towards the art market. I think for culture and beauty and meaning, but also a stability in value.
Andy Warhol downplayed his art, said it would just be sold and resold.
Well, it's like everything else. I think everything else should be recycled, like leftover food at restaurants.
He probably didn't foresee a $200 million recycling. Eric Sorensen, Global News, Toronto.
That is Global National for this Tuesday. I'm Donna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada is the Bicycle Thief art installation in downtown Halifax. We'd love to see Your Canada. Please email it to viewers@globalnational.com. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.